valued leader and a wonderful colleague. She was going actually to chair the panel on Thursday on social protection. And last week, still, she had mentioned to the organizing team and my colleague Magdi how important social protection was and had always been historically since the Caribbean nation's independence. So let me ask you that we please observe a minute of silence in her memory, and may she rest in peace. It is a sad day for us, as you can imagine, but I have now to present, as Alison would certainly have wanted us to do. So first, I want to recognize my colleague, Magdi Martinez-Soliman, UNDP resident representative for Barbados and the OECS, who put a lot of effort in organizing, along with my office, the series of consultations. Our distinguished panelists today, Ambassador Francine Barron, Senior Advisor to the Prime Minister of Dominica, Felipe de la Mota, from the European Union Delegation for Barbados and the OECS, Monica Labenet, Vice President of the Caribbean Development Bank, my colleague Diane Coelhes from the ECLAC Sub-Regional Office for the Caribbean, and Yitades Gebre, representative of PAHO WHO for the Eastern Caribbean, and of course, welcome to all the participants to this session today. By opening this series of conference called Consultations for Action Today, let me start with a simple fact, actually. We know that we'll end 2020 with a smaller global economy than at the start of the year. 170 countries, almost 90% of the world, will be worse off, according to the IMF. And of course, this downturn is anything but simple. The COVID-19 crisis is first and foremost a human tragedy, and it is more complex, more uncertain, and more severe than anything we have seen in living memory. Global output is expected to shrink by around 3% this year, as per the IMF, and we know also between at least 2 to 6% in Caribbean countries. We have all had an important role to play in helping to contain the spread of the virus and ensure that we get to a new normal where we can all live and work safely again. But it is also clear from the few months that have passed that it will take some time before people, businesses, and governments can reach this. And this is the case for the Caribbean too. For a region already affected by its low natural resource base, high indebtedness, low fiscal space, and high unemployment, COVID-19 serves only to deepen these issues, amongst others. And with the timing of COVID-19 being just ahead of the next hurricane season, matters for the region could not be worse, of course. It is for this reason that today and for the next 2 weeks, those discussions are very timely and needed. Financing recovery and building resilience in Caribbean small state is an imperative we need to tackle together, since the impact of COVID-19 in the long term will fundamentally be a major economic crisis for this region in particular, being highly vulnerable to external shocks, as we know. And we know the line is thin, but there are several fronts we need to work together on by pooling our institutional strength, resources, and capacities. And I would like to name 5 as some thought that can also be reflected upon during the next series of 5 webinars. First, the need to find ways to enhance liquidity so that countries have the resources they need to fight the pandemic. Second, the need to prevent further debt crisis, as such crises risk undermining both the COVID-19 response, but also sustainable development for the years to come. third, the need to engage with private creditors on debt relief efforts, and we have seen encouraging results in the region recently. And of course, the need to engage with private creditors to finance recovery. Fourth, aligning financial system with the sustainable development goals, especially in order to avoid losing the past decade gains. And fifth and foremost, I would say rebuilding differently and rebuilding better. I must say that the governments across the Caribbean have responded well. With the tight fiscal resource constraint that they face, governments have reacted quickly to contain this outbreak and to preserve as best they can their economies and the livelihood of their citizens. On the 6th of May, many of you had with me the pleasure of launching the UN Barbados and Eastern Caribbean multi-sector response plan to COVID-19. And this plan is part of the UN efforts to support countries in fostering international solidarity, but also to help mobilize financial resources and advocate for bringing resources and looking at debt, especially to meet the needs of Barbados and Eastern Caribbean small developing states. So with the activities that we plan over the next 9 months, we're drawing on the full capacities of the UN development system across 8 thematic pillars. And this multi-sector response plan will support in particular the immediate health and medium-term socio-economic needs of the region. It seeks especially to, one, further contain the spread of the virus pandemic. Second, to minimize the social and economic impact and ensure a resilient recovery. And third, to promote the protection and well-being of the most vulnerable. So our objective now is really to capitalize on this and to complement this plan by enriching the thinking with interventions for this response over the medium and longer term to support SDGs and the acceleration of SDGs. This is why UNDP, as technical lead for socio-economic response in close partnership with my office and the rest of the UN team, has organized a very exciting series of consultations, bringing together an experienced group of thought leaders to discuss some of the critical challenges facing the region in the wake of this pandemic. So for the next 3 weeks, I'm really very much looking forward to hearing the point raised and conclusion that you would reach from what should be a very rich set of discussions. And I'm sure Magdi will detail this a bit further, but we'll have five gathering to be organized. The first one today on development finance, as you know, but there would be another one on social protection this week. Then the third one would be on food security and economic diversification. The fourth one on reopening economies after the crisis. And the fifth one on the role of the private sectors and development partners in helping transitioning Caribbean economies to path of recovery and resilience. So again, I want to thank you, all of you who are providing the time and your thought to these consultations, and well, for the many who are listening into these discussions today and in the weeks to come. I want to end, of course, by giving a very special thank to UNDP team for organizing these consultations. Wishing you very, very successful debate. Thank you very much, and over to you, Magdi.
Thank you very much, Didier. Thank you very much for these opening words, and in particular for your remarks, which I would like to join in loving memory of Alison McLean. May she rest in peace. It's a bit of a shock, and it's not immediate that you can jump from the recollection of hers and to work, but we need to keep going, as you said it well, as she would have wanted us to keep going. So let me thank you for your opening statement. Let me thank all panelists. It took the one who took longer, took less than a day to confirm, which is highly unusual and enormously appreciated in terms of commitment and and kindness and attention to the needs of us as the organizers. I'd like to thank the UNDP team and the team in the resident coordinator's office, in particular, Stuart Davis and Ken Roy, who have helped us organize the series. 5 panels, 25 speakers, 4 financial institutions, 6 senior government officials, 7 development partners, and 8 UN leaders who will unpack for us 5 topics ranging from today's finance for the response to social protection, economic diversification, food security, reopening, and the role of the private sector and the development partners. Maybe our respective opening remarks can serve as an umbrella on the impact this pandemic is having on our lives, on our lifestyles, on our livelihoods, on the future as we wanted to build it with less inequality, more shared knowledge, and a better balance with our planet. The bad news that I believe the resident coordinator has addressed in the beginning of his statement is that we are facing economic ruin in the countries where the increase of expenditures in health, in social protection, in unemployment coverage, and in business bailouts has been coupled with a crash in revenues, lackluster economic activity, more like a stagnation, looking very much like a recession in the making, and the halt of tourism as a symptom, as a symbol that epitomizes the economic impact of the health crisis. Recovery strategies are needed, and the good news is that this is something the Caribbean has expertise on, has experience on, has knowledge on. But the Caribbean doesn't have the capital, the credit, the liquidity, and the finance. So my first big point is that we will need an extraordinary injection of development assistance, better if a mix of reimbursable and non-reimbursable instruments, if the creditors would ever want to see their debtors' obligations fulfilled. These countries in the Caribbean are clearly not too big to fail, but they may become too weak to pay. Both for the credit institutions and the countries themselves, default needs to be carefully avoided. My second point is that there is no real alternative to a cautious reopening of the economy when and where it can be done without putting lives at risk. The key concept here is perhaps flexibility. The capacity to do reversals, moving back and forth, must be in the government's toolbox. Opening as a stampede would be lethal, not trying to reopen, even if gradually, tantamount activating an economic time bomb. Third, and here a big score for the Caribbean, where this mistake has clearly not been committed, a health and economic not managed best with acrimonious, divisive media manipulation. Good governance of the crisis is also a key for success, but there's no room for complacency, and early warning eyes and ears should be attentive to symptoms of social unrest. Our TV screens are full of such these days. Fourth, closing was tough to decide, but easy to implement, easy to understand. It was binary and clear-cut, those who stay in and the few who must be out. Mostly, it was about what we couldn't do. Reopening is also tough, who goes first, who goes last, but it is both complex, what are the risks, and confusing, who can do what and when. A very great deal of good public outreach, social consensus, institutional collaboration, civic discipline, and credible information is needed. It is about collective and individual risk management. Again, something the Caribbean is good at. My last point, perhaps the most controversial in what I have to say today, is that echoing what a Spanish philosopher, Daniel Innerarity, has recently written, I too believe that COVID-19 is a virus. It highlights the importance of that every populist despises. It places science at the apex of the response. It requires the web of state institutions and social solidarity to function apiece. And it claims the notion of a global community. Of course, there are and will be protectionist reactions, selfish and barely veiled profiteers of the response and the vaccine. The hard to define malaise of COVID and its implications, the fear it generates, are a breeding ground for bad governance proponents, but they will not prevail. It is simply unimaginable that one country would have the solution and keep it to itself, or make a racket of it. Protectionism is not an option for SIDS and for many other nations. Science, our institutions, and solidarity will protect the global village. At least I hope so. And I hope these series of conferences will shed light on the road to the future. We have a wealth of knowledge on the panels that start today. Let me finally thank again the UN Resident Coordinator for his leadership throughout, and in particular for supporting and actually helping shape this initiative of ideas and cooperation for the next future of the Caribbean. With this, I would like to introduce Ambassador Francine Barron and ask her to take the floor. Ambassador Barron is the Senior Advisor to the Honorable Prime Minister of the Commonwealth of Dominica and its former Foreign Minister. Ambassador Barron is an attorney by trade and has served as the Minister for Foreign and CARICOM Affairs from 2014 to 2019. She previously served as Attorney General from 2007 to 2010 and was appointed High Commissioner for Dominica to the United Kingdom from 2012 to 2014. With this, Ambassador Barron, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, Mr. Solomon. And before I begin, I wish to extend my condolences to the family, friends, and colleagues of Ms. Alison McLean on her untimely passing. May she rest in peace. I want to take this opportunity to thank the UN, and in particular, Mr. Tribuk and Mr. Solomon and the rest of the UNDP team for organizing what I think is a timely and important discussion on the important issue of development finance in a COVID-19 context. I think we are all painfully aware of the significant impact that this COVID-19 virus is having across the world. Lives and livelihoods are being lost daily, and this situation may be with us for many, many months to come. The social, health, and economic impact is being experienced by all countries in some shape or form. In the Caribbean, we have largely been able to contain and control the spread of this virus by taking swift action to close our borders, enforce stringent lockdowns and quarantines, and practice social distancing and implementing hygienic measures. In a region that is arguably the most tourism and trade dependent region in the world, the impact on our economies has been devastating. In some countries, up to 50% of GDP comes from tourism, and government revenues for April, for example, has been reduced by 40 to 60%. So for a variety of reasons, it may be years before tourism in the Caribbean returns to its pre-COVID levels. Throw into that mix the fact that we are entering an active hurricane season, and we have had the recent experiences of the devastation caused to our islands by Hurricanes Irma, Maria, and Dorian to factor in. We are actually in a situation almost of Russian roulette, but none of us are controlling the trigger, and we don't know which of our islands will be hit this year. The reality of the impact of climate change and the imperative to become resilient must still remain at the forefront of our planning. Add to this our inherent vulnerabilities as small island developing states and our high levels of indebtedness, and we see that we have a recipe for disaster. We have been urging, pleading, and advocating in all manner of fora for many years now that this artificial yardstick of GDP per capita for accessing grant and concessional finance is unfair and detrimental for SIDS because of our peculiar vulnerabilities. We find ourselves now facing a crisis of unimaginable proportions, where in a matter of just a few months, unemployment levels have doubled or tripled, where government revenues have significantly declined, where health costs have risen sharply, and for the foreseeable future, this situation will continue. If there ever was a time to finally hear us, this is it. Countless lives and livelihoods are at stake. We must open our borders. We must take appropriate measures to social distance and keep people safe. We must enhance our health systems. We must have the ability to identify, trace, and treat this disease. How do we do this when most of our countries are in debt distress? When most of us cannot access concessional financing? When the very backbone of our economy has been substantially undermined? COVID-19 has directly impacted the fiscal situation of all countries, and a major concern for each country is liquidity. Our countries need new financing, preferably grant and/or highly concessional and quick disbursing finance. Many of our countries are already heavily indebted, and in many cases, as a result of borrowing to respond to natural disasters. Our small size, the dependence on external markets or external sources for everything, trade, tourism, foreign direct investment, and the fragility of this condition in relation to old and new and emerging risks and challenges have been amplified. The urgency with which COVID-19 must be addressed means that development partners must be willing to reconsider the constraints which make it difficult for countries to gain access to new financing. We welcome the effort that has been made by some development partners in reaching out to the region. The introduction of the contingent emergency response component is a program that has been approved by World Bank for Dominica and other IDA countries. And this has allowed us to utilize funds already approved to be redirected to funding COVID-19 response activities. We acknowledge also the Pandemic Emergency Financing Facility and Special COVID Response Facility, as well as the G20 Debt Suspension Initiative. We also acknowledge the Rapid Credit Facility and the Rapid Financing Instrument being made available by the IMF. In addition, the CDB has also approved a facility to assist in financing debt repayment. Of course, several other multilateral agencies and bilateral governments have come forward with initiatives that will provide some level of assistance. While these are all useful instruments, they are limited in several ways. Many are loans, not grants. Whilst we appreciate the deferment of debt payment, they will still fall due in the future. No one instrument is adequate to cover the needs, and in many cases, the combined amount available may still be inadequate to meet the cost of this pandemic. And the process for access for some is still too cumbersome for what is really in effect an emergency situation. And not all countries can access the various facilities. The usual constraints still remain. What COVID now exposes would be the same as that of any exogenous shock. The region is vulnerable. Its development is fragile and delicate. There needs to be a separate and special designation for countries as vulnerable as ours are. There should be special economic and financial safety nets to guard and ensure against the eventualities that exogenous shocks damage and destabilize our economies. Countries whose development achievements and milestones can be erased literally overnight, as was done for Dominica when Hurricane Maria hit us in 2017. We need added protections. Some of those protection mechanisms should involve continued access to development finance at favorable rates. It is important that countries be allowed to mature financially so that they may be able to respond to the needs within their economies in time of crisis. If all the money, the funds, the resources of small economies are tied in external debt, be it loans, interest, repayments, then the country cannot grow financially. If it cannot grow financially, it cannot grow economically. Without question, we must address the high debt issue. Countries need to use their resources to invest in local projects that create jobs, that in turn will result in activity and movement in the national economy. There is no value addition to small vulnerable economies that are dependent on external sources of income to be paying back debt to external entities. Debt repayment now by countries as small as the OECS will not be significant enough to impact any multilateral development bank or third country. Yet, at the same time, that comparatively small external repayment is significant when you consider the possible impact within microeconomies. We must therefore consider alternatives that allow countries to have the fiscal space that they need to address this crisis. We must consider options for debt forgiveness, debt for nature or climate change swaps. The region should be able to use its resources in negotiating financing options. Our experience is that these are very expensive to negotiate and may not necessarily raise the level of financing required. There is also limited experience in the region on this matter. The UN system may wish to assist in the development of that capacity. We should consider also whether the IMF Article 8, Section 2 on debt standstill can be invoked. We acknowledge also that the private sector has a role to play in leveraging domestic financing for development. The challenge is how to entice them and encourage their interests. They see the same risks and challenges to their investment as any MDB or development finance partner. We need to develop bankable projects that are attractive enough to attract and maintain the interest of private finance. One of the things that donors and partners can do is to provide grants and technical assistance for project creation and project design. This is a greatly needed element of support, lacking from a lot of development finance opportunities that seek to fund already developed or designed projects. Ultimately, the road to development is the same for all, meaning that there are certain milestones that we must all achieve. The underlying and enabling factors or inhibiting elements are not the same, and that is where the focus should be placed. How different should the development finance environment be to enable different countries with different conditions and challenges to achieve the same goals and to be able to deliver on the 2030 agenda? In respect of what can be done by our development partners, including the UN, to support and address the issue of access to development finance, we need the issue of graduation and the GDP per capita criterion for accessing development finance removed in respect of SIDS and replaced by a vulnerability index as a matter of urgency. The advocacy of the UN in that respect would be invaluable. There should be greater opportunities for debt restructuring, including debt forgiveness, debt standstill, debt for nature swaps or carbon credits, and other refinancing options. And technical assistance and support in negotiating these things could be supported by the UN and others. Grant finance that is easily accessible should be available for climate investment and building resilience.
For your contribution. So much has been said about the need for new instruments, for liquidity, and Ambassador Barron just mentioned the work of the CDB. We have with us the Vice President of the Caribbean Development Bank, Ms. Monica LeBennett. She's the Vice President of Operations at the bank and the leader of the Economics and Projects Department, the Renewable Energy Efficiency Unit, and the Public-Private Partnerships Unit. Vice President LeBennett chairs CDB's Loans Committee and spearheads the bank's engagement with its borrowing members and development partners. Ms. Monica, you do have the floor.
Thank you very much, Magdi. Let me also express the condolences of the bank and, of course, on my own behalf on the passing of Alison. Her energy and enthusiasm will sorely be missed by all of us, I'm sure. And let me also thank you for arranging this very important series. I do have a presentation, which I will ask them to share. Before I get into it proper, I wanted to kind of set up a little bit of context. COVID-19 has impacted all of our BMCs, as Ambassador Barron just indicated. And basically, there are three areas, which also she talked about, that the BMCs are looking for. They're looking for some sort of moratoria or debt forgiveness. They're looking for grant financing, and they're looking for support with their health services. CDB, as a small institution and as an MDB, we have a lot of difficulty with the first one, the moratoria and the debt forgiveness, because that would have quite a deleterious impact on the bank. In terms of grants, we have access to limited grants from various development partners, and they are for specific areas. Actually, we do have some grants for some of the project preparation that Ambassador Barron talked about. We also, at the moment, do not have a health portfolio. And so our response has been along the line of repurposing undisbursed balances within our portfolio, using concessional resources to assist those countries that are eligible for those resources. And we recognize that there are some of our countries that are not eligible. And we are in the process of trying to see if we can try to address that. And the third area is that we want to collaborate, or we have been collaborating with partners to intermediate funds through us for affected countries, or also to co-finance projects, right? Next slide, please. So in terms of our response, I wanted to look at 4 areas. Basically, what we're doing for MSMEs, budgetary support, education, and capital works and agriculture. And I'm going to look both at the medium and the longer term, because as everyone will recall, there is a life after COVID. And I think while we address the immediate, we also need to look to the post-COVID environment as well. Next slide. So in terms of our support to MSMEs, the focus is really on restoration of operations, more business recovery, because a lot of the MSMEs have been impacted by the shutdown and all the other impacts of COVID. So we're focusing more on restoration of operations, and we're encouraging MSMEs to focus on the restoration of operations as opposed to expanding at this particular point in time. We see a reduction in demand for our traditional development credit in the short and medium term. And what has come through very clearly is that what the support is required is more to cover liquidity shortfalls, possibly going up to the next 24 months. We have a little bit of a challenge with the liquidity provision, but we are currently pursuing a change in our policy to allow us to, at least for some time period, to be able to address this, right? Next slide. As noted, government revenues have been hit by the interruption of tourism and other sectors, and expenditures have increased quite significantly because of the need to support all the impacts of COVID. And of course, this combination has resulted in significant financing needs. Our approach is twofold here. One is that, as Ambassador Barron mentioned, we have already approved a number of debt service loans, which will enhance liquidity in the countries that have been offered these facilities. And what it does is it covers our ordinary capital debt service for a period of 1 year to allow the countries to utilize those resources rather than to pay us. They can do other things with it. We also are in the process of doing some policy-based loans, and we're trying to utilize some of our concessional resources. We don't have a lot of the concessional resources left in our Special Development Fund because this is the last year of the current cycle. So we are using some of the concessional resources for our policy-based loans. And our focus, of course, is to look at reforms that would promote fiscal sustainability, sustainable and inclusive growth, social protection, and physical resilience. So these are part of this kind of underpinning of the discussions that we would have with our countries in terms of what would be the underlying initiatives associated with the policy-based loans. And as I said, some part of those loans would be at concessionary rates. Next slide, please. Our main area for repurposing of our undisbursed balances has been in the area of education. Of course, our education services all moved online, and that created a whole raft of challenges for the education sector. So we have been, in several of our countries, utilizing our undisbursed balances for existing projects for the provision of ICT devices and peripherals, particularly for those students who do not have access, payment of stipends and salaries for teachers. We have a project ongoing with PAHO and UNICEF on psychosocial support, and we've extended it for education. We have used some of our resources for provision of food items for families and students in lieu of school feeding programs, provided learning packages for students for distance learning, and of course, training teachers and principals to be able to more effectively utilize this online and remote learning platform and interface, which of course is a whole new area for them. So a lot of our resources and our effort over the last 2 months or so has been in this area, all right? Next slide, please. In terms of capital works, we need to get the economies going again. The shutdown, of course, has impacted a lot of our priority development projects in our countries. And so we have been providing financing to restart the construction sector and working with our countries, because of course, if you can get people back to work, then the economy starts to turn. Going into the medium to longer term, we know that development finance is going to be needed to incentivize renewable energy and energy efficient projects. We do have some resources to assist, and some of it is grant in that regard. So that is an area that we will enhance, accelerate. And then of course, we talked about rebuilding differently and better. One of the 5 points raised by Didier. And this whole notion of providing development finance to incorporate climate resilience in capital projects is another area that we are working, actually we have been working in for some time. All of our infrastructure projects undergo a climate resilience screening, so that what we build is in fact built stronger and better and more resilient to climate change. And finally, I want to talk about what we're doing. Next slide, please. In agriculture and trade. I think that COVID-19 has intensified the need for us to accelerate the whole notion of interregional trade, and also to accelerate the CARICOM's Agri-Food Action Plan. And these are some areas that we are working on, developing of supporting infrastructure, the roads, irrigation systems, and packing stations. Putting systems in place to ensure that farmers can deliver adequate quality and quantity of produce to market and outlets in a timely manner. So we're strengthening the link between the farmers and the marketing outlets. We're working on production planning to ensure that there are no cycles of gluts and shortages in production. We're working on business facilitation, including the assistance of installation of electronic platforms for trade. And finally, in terms of logistics infrastructure, we're working on trying to assist in the movement of goods within and across the region. Because as I said, one of the things that COVID-19 kind of highlighted is the need for us to have a greater level of interregional trade. Currently, we have agriculture produce in excess in one part of the region and shortages in another part of the region. So in a nutshell, that's kind of where CDB has been, or how CDB has been working to try to provide some assistance and support for COVID-19. So I'll leave it there and wait for questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vice President LeBennett. Thank you also for the wonderful presentation. Both the speech and the statement of the UN resident coordinator, and of course all other panelists, Ambassador Francine Baron, and your beautifully put together presentation will be part of the annals of these series, and therefore we're very recognizant of the fact that you have put effort and a very nice touch to the presentation itself, apart from the extremely interesting content that was even better carried through that graphic outlay. Let me now move to a man who has been our lead on the health response. Dr. Yitades Gebre is the PAHO and WHO representative to Barbados and the Eastern Caribbean countries. Most of you have seen him in action over the past months. Dr. Gebre has over 24 years of public health leadership and management experience, having worked with health teams and national officials in the Bahamas, in Jamaica, in Suriname, in Trinidad and Tobago, and in 12 other Eastern Caribbean countries. He joined the organization in 2005 as an advisor on disease prevention and control in the PAHO Bahamas country office, and is, as you all know, now leading the UN's response on health in the region. Dr. Gebre, Yitades, you have the floor.
Okay, good morning to you all. Thank you very much, Magdi, and I'm very pleased to be here and also to be among the other panelists. Good morning to you. I have a presentation, if that is to be, here we have it. As you know, COVID-19 was one of the most, next slide please, the most important disease which we have been dealing in the last century. Here are my 4 key messages for this morning. First of all, COVID-19 is not over yet. Transmissibility and severity of the virus remains unchanged. We need to suppress the virus, the transmission in our communities. The second point is that the exiting the lockdown, we have to have a stepwise approach and the release of measures to be also measurable, and replace the lockdown with a strong, empowered communities to sustain the new normal. The third point is that we need to support the health system to cope. First, they should be able to test, isolate, treat, and then trace and quarantine as we also moving into the next phase of this outbreak. The fourth one is the CARICOM strategy have to be aligned with the national strategies based on science and evidence, and to be balanced. It's not about economy is important than health, or health is important than the economy. It has to be both. Next. So what is the current state of affairs? As I mentioned, it is the greatest global shock in decades. Hundreds of thousands of lives have been lost, and the world economy likely faces the worst recession, as the economists and others just spoke earlier. The resulting loss of employment, as you have seen, the ambassador, Her Excellency, mentioned earlier in our region, and income loss will cause further damage to livelihoods, health, and the sustainable development. Next one. So here is the the current situation. While the curve of the pandemic begins to fall in the most parts of the world, and especially in Europe, the pandemic is now more active in South America, and extensive community transmission is taking place, especially in Brazil, Chile, and Peru. In this graph, you see on the top, the light blue is United States, and then followed by the kind of pink is Brazil, and the green is Mexico. These are the three countries which we have a continuous increase in the number of cases. When it comes on Eastern Caribbean countries, over the last 4.5 months, we had a total of 219 cases and 12 deaths, unfortunately. That is a very good numbers to work with and then anticipate if there will be a new peak as we also open the economy. Next one. The next one, the death from this, from other countries, as you may see it here, it peaked somewhere. This is on a daily basis, and still we are seeing a peak which is manageable in terms of the need for health services compared to the number of new cases. It's a slight decrease, which is still a lot has to be done. Next one. Finally, what it looks like to have the incidence cases from North America. The top one is the green one is USA. The incidence, even though shows a slight decrease over the time period, is still very high. The next one is Canada, and there is a slight decrease. However, when we look at Mexico, Mexico continues to have the highest incidence of 17 per 100,000 population, and then continuing. So all this data shows us that when the Caribbean countries open up, there is a result in terms of transmission when individuals are coming, and then the movement where the borders were closed, it has reduced significantly the transmission of diseases for a longer period. Next one. And it has been manageable. So the downward trend in the disease observed in Eastern Caribbean is due to the public health measures put in place by the countries and the governments to break the chain of transmission. It's not because of other unanswered questions why we have a lower infection rate in the Eastern Caribbean countries. Even though I mentioned there were about 292 cases in the Eastern Caribbean, when we also take into consideration the French territories, we have observed almost 1,000 cases over the same period of time. Next one. So what are these measures which were taken by the government? It is here aggregated. Somewhere January the 30th, the World Health Organization determined the presence of a public health emergency of international concern. Since then, by mid-February or late February, we have the epidemics in Europe. And then it was late declaration in terms of the first week in March that it was characterized as a pandemic, which is affecting all countries and more than one country in a region. So since then, the darker yellow ones or the orange color would show you how many of the countries have taken public health measures and social measures to reduce transmission and then to reduce death. And that is the lockdowns, the movement restriction, the next one, and then the social distancing overall. So there are different types of measures which countries have taken and resulted in the slowing of the transmission and also slowing of the number of deaths and then the capacity of the health system to respond. Next one. So we have had this lockdown between 4 to 6 weeks and sometimes longer for some countries. So what does that mean? We didn't emerge from the lockdown suddenly immune from coronavirus. Actually, we all, the vast majority of us remain susceptible. Therefore, moving forward, this has to be taken into consideration. Next one. So what is the next activity and successful implementation in public health measures and social measures have to take in place when we open the economy? First, we have to ensure adequate capacity for testing and tracking of the individuals, tracing of individuals who may need the treatment. We have to reassign in training of non-public health officials, staff from the national level, also from the district level. The second one is we have to establish a mechanism to govern delivery of the health system of core and community essential health services. In some countries, as we have the lockdown, certain health services were dropped down. Therefore, we cannot continue to do that. We have to maintain essential health services for all. Thirdly, we have to identify the context relevant list of essential services, which could not be, and also medicines. There are shortage of medicines. The same countries which are providing some of the products were not able to make it available because of the lockdown and other mechanisms. The fourth one is we have to optimize essential service delivery settings and platforms. Finally, we have to redistribute the health workforce. So in all this, as the Vice President of CDB mentioned, the countries and governments need to have additional resources to meet these public health obligations. Next one. So what is needed? There should be a close collaboration for public health and social services to ensure that everybody knows how to seek testing or medical attention to find and test suspected cases quickly, isolate them, treat patients effectively, trace the contacts and quarantine the contacts timely. To ensure this, we have to safeguard also the patients who have been discharged appropriately and then post-hospital care, including reducing stigma and discrimination in communities where individuals are going back. Next one. So what do we expect? Would there be another peak? Would there be another wave? As this, the world is still have a big wave of the COVID-19 pandemic. We are not out of that yet. However, we cannot be also complacent in the Caribbean because we have stopped the transmission, reduced the transmission significantly. All countries, including the Caribbean, have to continue to work toward this a public health and social measure when it has lifted no new infections to be followed back. And then if it is a new infections, immediately to stamp it out. We do not flatten the curve. We just shift the infection peak if we don't put public health measures properly. As Magdi earlier mentioned, we have to do the measurement both sides, relaxing and making it also tighter. There will be other peaks, there will be other waves. Next one. Therefore, in this discussion this morning, I have to emphasize we have to build a resilient health systems, which is also standing the COVID-19, as well as the imminent danger of the hurricane season and natural disasters and others. And then we have to increase the health system capacity to respond efficiently and effectively. Thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gebre. As always, I'm always surprised of how you manage at every level to introduce public health messaging in the most sophisticated ways with always excellent backing of facts and figures and in a very subtle but effective manner. And thank you very much again for your participation and for the excellent presentation. Our next speaker, last but by no means least, is Ms. Diane Qualis. I'm sure she would have taken a very good note when Ambassador Francine Barron mentioned the debt swap. Diane Qualis is the director of the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean sub-regional headquarters for the Caribbean in Port of Spain. Ms. Quallis previously served for 6 years as chief of the Small Island Developing States Unit, and also as the head of the Partnerships for Sustainable Development in the Department of Economic and Social Affairs of the UN DESA. Ms. Quallis's analytics and policy work is a constant reference for the region and its leadership, certainly for the UN leadership. So Diane, please, you have the floor.
On mute. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Magdi. Wonderful to be here. It's going to be a bad week for me. Alison was a dear friend from our very young years. We essentially grew up together through high school and university. So it is a profound personal loss for me. But I want to celebrate her life this year. She was a bright light that has been prematurely extinguished, but we will continue to live for her through our work. I am conscious of the time, so I'm going to go quickly because the essential messaging of my presentation has been captured through what has already been said by almost all speakers. What I'm going to be offering more is the justification, the fundamentals, the basis for the advocacy that is needed. I was very caught by the presentation that was made by Ambassador Barron, because she made very critical points, I think, that are relevant for how we go forward in terms of engaging the international community for support in development finance. And I think it's really very good that you have begun this series with this idea of the importance of development finance, because our country, the countries of the Caribbean are unique. Okay, hold on. So I'm gonna have to, because I'm not able to move the slides. Oh, did I do that, or okay. We are a group of small, open, highly vulnerable, heavily indebted, middle-income countries, and it has put the Caribbean in a uniquely disadvantageous situation. And I think that point has been already very well made by Francine, so I don't need to go into it. I'm showing you essentially how the externalities dramatically impact the Caribbean. And I'm speaking now of the impact of climate change, exogenous factors, whether it be climate, hurricanes, whether it be external economic factors. And here now we have the externality that has been introduced by a pandemic. If you see the graph on the left-hand side, it demonstrates how the growth trajectory of the Caribbean dramatically fell with the global financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9. And we went all the way down to -4. We have not really been able to recover since. We've been struggling with recovery since the global financial crisis, which is now 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. And here now, we face in 2020, a global pandemic, which is going to, by virtue of the need for the response that Dr. Gabriel has just described, the need for that response, be it through the shutting down of the economy to ensure that we do not spread the infection, and those activities that we have had to do in support of the populace, the social measures, we find ourselves in a situation where it is most likely that we will be facing negative growth that's close to -6 in 2020 alone. And we don't even really know what happens next year. Another important issue for addressing development finance is the constitution of the debt, which is the graph to the right. And you will notice, for example, that Barbados, Bahamas, Trinidad and Tobago, St. Lucia are among those countries that have very high domestic debt, and the treatment of domestic debt as against external debt is different and challenging in its own way. So these are the circumstances that create already that liquidity challenge, which is exacerbated by the issue of debt service. Debt servicing, the range of debt servicing has gone all the way as high as 102. 102 means that you don't even have 1 cent from your GDP to spend. The average over the past 10 years has been just under 30%. But if you see I don't know if you can see the graph to the right, Jamaica has averaged a debt service in excess of something like 68%. We have identified over 3 phase 1 countries, which are the countries that we're working with on our debt initiative. Antigua and Barbuda, 42%, St. Lucia, 32%, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, 26%. That speaks directly to the liquidity challenge. What resources that the government has in the face of a crisis as this to invest in reconstruction, building back better, but also in remedial measures. So the issue of high debt servicing costs and the impact that it has on the liquidity and the fiscal space of the government, its ability to address the challenges severely limited. This question now I have identified specifically, applied specifically to COVID. And we see where COVID-19 is expected to dramatically impact the growth rate of the countries of the Caribbean, 6.9% in 2020. To the right, the phase 1 countries, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Antigua and Barbuda. What we're seeing is that we estimate a minus 7% in their growth rate for 2020 as a result of COVID. Compare that with the remaining developing countries. What we're seeing is it is the vulnerability of the countries of the region, and I'm using our phase 1 countries because they're the ones that we are currently working with to address our debt initiative. We're looking at, in the case of those 3 Eastern Caribbean countries, a negative 7% in growth compared to an average of negative 1% for other developing countries. These are issues that we need to take into consideration when we appeal for remedial concessionary support, which I will address a little later. We have done recent research, which we're just about getting ready to launch, that gives 3 scenarios for the impact of COVID on the tourism sector, which for the Eastern Caribbean is mostly tourism. The largest, it's the engine of the economy. And we've described 3 scenarios, which I won't go into now, but essentially the one that would have our economies all reopening fully by the beginning of June. That's the optimistic scenario. And the pessimistic one has a second wave taking us into next year. So we have a base scenario, an optimistic, and a pessimistic scenario. And you will see from those 3 scenarios that we're looking at anywhere between 50% and 75%. So the optimistic is a 57% fall in visitor arrivals, and the pessimistic 75%, and the loss in tourism expenditure between 22 and 28 billion US dollars in this year alone. That's the challenge. The issue of international transportation and a version, a dimension of the tourism industry, critical because, of course, travel, not only in terms of air travel, but cruise ships, cruise tourism, as well as commercial shipping, All of this critical to the survival of our economies. And we're looking really at 252 billion in losses for our region. 74% of revenues for 6 months of 2020 to be impacted. I'm gonna run it. This one was really just to say, you know, imbalance. It's not always bad news. Much of the Trinidad and Tobago and Guyana will not be as lucky, but the rest of the Caribbean actually benefits from the fall in energy. So that's a positive. The issue of the fiscal efforts in terms of the interventions that governments have been making, and these have been quite considerable. We've actually had a meeting with the ministers of social welfare. They've spoken about the food packages that have had to be done. They've had soup kitchens and seedling production, distribution, allowances for pensions, support for women in the tourism industry. We've had quite a bit of effort invested in payroll support schemes, 343 million and 167 million in grants to businesses. This has already been invested by the governments of the region, 434 million in unemployment schemes. So quite a significant amount of effort put into social security programs representing, I have put a couple of examples on the left, representing the percentage of investment of GDP in this response, just dealing with ensuring the welfare of the population. 4.4% of Antigua and Barbuda's current GDP, it has been invested in these schemes in support of the business. One of the areas that I think Monica mentioned that is also very important, which is going to be, depending on how long COVID stays with us, that investment in education infrastructure. So many countries have indicated the challenge of how do we ensure that all of the children have access to online learning, if that is going to be the way, if we're not going to be going back into the schoolroom in the short term. That is very, very important. This is a meeting of finance ministers that my executive secretary, Alicia Barsine, had a couple of weeks ago, and we had an opportunity, many ministers online expressing their particular concerns. And of course, there's our debt initiative. That whole question of liquidity support and advancing fiscal space. My team tells me that the critical things that we need to ensure, and I think that, you know, I share some of the views expressed by Ambassador Barron, long-term, low-cost development financing to address the issues of climate change, not just the response, but also the building back better, the building back stronger, the resilience building, the investment in green industry, which does both resilience strengthening as well as investing in the restructuring of the economy, structural adjustment to the economy so that we have a more resilient growth trajectory invested in. So the issue of addressing pandemics, unforeseens, externalities, reconstruction and hurricanes, all of that needs long-term, low-cost development financing. We cannot afford to have the situation where we are borrowing at normal rates because we have been graduated. And this is where the point that Ambassador Barron makes is extremely important. The question of state contingent instruments, we're talking about GDP index bonds and hurricane clauses, that we need to have vulnerability indices linked to our loans so that there is an appreciation of the real exposure to external externalities, to external exogenous impacts. That must be taken into consideration. We cannot be treated like the average man in the street. And then in circumstances such as this, we need a rapid financing based, that is on a concessional basis to ensure that we flatten the recessional curve. These are critical issues. I want to just spend 1 minute on this resilience fund, which is integral to our debt for Debt for Climate Adaptation Resilience Initiative, which we have been working with, as I have indicated, St. Lucia, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, and Antigua and Barbuda. And I am not going to go into it in detail, but I am very happy to answer questions. Suffice it to say that this is the kind of concessional and consideration of an initiative, an instrument that speaks to the challenges that the Caribbean face. We want to find a way to apply a haircut to the level of debt, the current level of debt of the countries, have that reduced amount of debt invested instead in a resilience building fund. And it will be used then to invest in green projects, in resilience projects. We're working with those 3 countries to see how we work with the creditors. That haircut on the debt would have to be given by creditors. And we've already heard from Monica that there are no moratoriums being offered by CDB, but there may be other external IFIs that will give that consideration. We are working against the fact that the majority of the countries of the region are upper middle or upper level, and therefore graduated, not deserving, not entitled to concessional finance. But if you look at the overall circumstances that I have described, these are countries that are deserving of some special kind of consideration given their vulnerability. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Diane. That was quite a significant content with numerous proposals, some of them very innovative. Thank you very much for sharing those with us. I am going to go quickly to our last speaker today. Mr. Felipe de la Mota is currently the head of the sector of regional integration and trade of the European Union delegation to Barbados, the OECS CARICOM and CARIFORUM. Prior to his current appointment, he served in Egypt in the EU delegation. And before that, he held various positions at headquarters in Brussels at the Directorate General for Economic and Financial Affairs and the DG for Neighborhood countries. So Felipe, without further ado, you have the floor. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Magdi. Thank you for inviting us. I mean, first of all, I'd like to express on behalf of myself and my colleagues, of course, our condolences for the loss of Alison Bean. And we also like to thank you for putting together this sort of presentation. Now, I'm very confident on issues, so I'm going to skip the agnostic analysis that has been done already by the colleagues and the grim projections and scenarios that the Caribbean economies are facing. I think we're all conscious that the word of the day is unprecedented, applying both to the situation, but also to the response that is being given. We're seeing fiscal measures around the world, very innovative, but also huge in terms of 20 to 40% of GDP worth of fiscal measures, monetary measures. So all this is indeed unprecedented. But I think the purpose of the panel is to understand as well what this context could mean in terms of development finance in the Caribbean. And I think I'd like to make emphasis on maybe a few points here. As you know, in the past years, many development partners, among them the EU, have moved beyond a traditional approach and into the more billions to trillions mindset, which basically acknowledges that we need to work together with the private sector if we want to find sustainable development results together. We can't all do it alone. We need to be all on the same table. And in this spirit, I'm going to go a bit into the details of some more innovative financial support mechanisms that we have and what we've learned from them in the past years. As you know, traditionally, the EU is providing mostly grant finance. Basically, in the region from 2014 to 2020, the EU has provided about 1 billion euros in grant financing. We do this through budget support operations, which is direct funds to the governments, the liquidity issues that we've been mentioning. We've been hearing by the other panelists from the public point of view. We've been providing quite a lot of support in that, but also technical assistance to governments to build capacity in region institutions as well. or grants for specific actions where we support both governments, but also regional institutions and civil society as well. So all this has been more the classic support. And in there, we had as well the blending finance, which we call when we come in with grant finance to support loans, usually from IFIs, from international financial institution colleagues, to make certain operations more financeable. We do this to make the investment feasible, and it can use several forms. It can be to extend the tenor, to reduce interest rates, to finance the necessary preparatory studies, etc., or just support for the governments with technical assistance to achieve the necessary regulatory reforms. We could theoretically also do guarantees, but we haven't done that yet in the region. But I'll go to this in a minute. I mean, in terms of maybe just recent responses to COVID, we have indeed been supporting CARFA, we've been supporting PAHO, we've been front loading quite a bit of these budget support payments to make sure the governments can have a bit more buffer to respond. But indeed, we need to address the recovery and how we can help support investment in this region. Now, in 2017, the EU launched the External Investment Plan, which was basically a 1.5 billion euro guarantee in Africa and in what we call the neighborhood countries, which was basically meant to de-risk private sector, to encourage investment in least attractive climates, whether because of the political situation or whether because the credit risk was too high. Now, this was combined with the rest of the blending facilities, but the purpose here was more to bring in the private sector to say, all right, we understand you have the means, you have the knowledge, you know what you want to do, but you're just finding this investment too risky. We can come in, we can take part of that risk and help you come in. We don't pretend to be the private sector. We just want to enable the private sector to come in where they're not that comfortable to come in. Now, what we found from this is, first of all, we were the 1.5 billion was oversubscribed. We had like 4 times that amount in requests from the IFIs and from private sector. So there's clearly a demand for this type of instrument. Now, this is a novelty in the way we work, of course. So there's been a bit of a learning curve, and it's still early to know what the results are. The guarantee facilities that we approved at that time, about 30, we're still in the process of signing many of them, but I think there's some lessons that we can already draw. First of all, the investments won't happen in the absence of an enabling business environment. I mean, we need to understand that private sector is the private sector. We can de-risk to a certain point, but they will only go where they have the security that there is rule of law, that the investment climate is correct, that they can have recourse to justice if the investment goes wrong, etc., etc. They need to look at the operation from a private sector perspective. We can take some risk off, but the enabling environment needs to be attractive. And in that sense, I think the feeling is also when we look at reports like the Doing Business Report 2019 by the World Bank, there is still quite some room to grow in the region. When we look at only Jamaica out of the CARICOM countries is in the top 50% of all the countries in that ranking. So there's room to grow, and it's important to attract private sector because the discussion for now has been liquidity in the public sector. I think that has been discussed at length by the other panelists, but we need to acknowledge that the banks in the region, but other investors also have quite a lot of liquidity available. It's a question of mobilizing that liquidity to support that channeling through to investments. Now, the Global Competitiveness Report by the World Economic Forum is not terribly good either for the region. So all this to say that there's a lot of reasons maybe for this enabling environment to be able to improve. And a lot of it has to do with or can be solved through regional discussions. It can be resolved at regional level. Not all of them and not in the short term, but this is something definitely that we found in the deployment of the initial phase of the external investment plan, that no matter the risk we took out, some countries or some regions, the investors would still not go in. Second, and this was already raised by Ambassador Barron, there is a dearth of investable, bankable projects. And indeed, I mean, realistic, financial viable, environmentally and socially sustainable projects are not easy to develop. They aren't always obvious, and they require quite a lot of interaction between financial support donors, for example, but also the private sector and the government. You need to, of course, from the side of the administration, you need to be vigilant of bad investments that could cause reputational damage or worse. You need to analyze carefully the structures of PPP options, the tax incentive schemes, etc. But at the same time, you need to be supportive of good and innovative ideas. And that requires changing a bit the mindset, sitting down with the private sector and seeing how things can move forward together. And maybe this on one final point in terms of lessons learned, we saw that indeed governments should be confident in encouraging and working with new financial products. It can't be left to the administrations, stretched as they are already, to develop these financial products, but they can put the pressure on the financial institutions, on the international partners to come with ready-made solutions supportive of sustainable development, and that the governments can stand behind, or say, well, this works for us, this doesn't, please come back again, suggest some other schemes. Maybe to give some examples of what we have in mind, what we've already been doing in some other areas, but which could also be applied under the new financing of because of course, sorry, I forgot to mention the external investment plan in the new financing period for the EU, which comes now for 2021 to 2027, will be extended to the rest of the world. So the Caribbean will be eligible for this type of financial guarantee. They can support bonds, credit lines, investment projects, insurance schemes, digitalization options, venture capital, catastrophic bonds, you name it. There are a lot of options out there where we can look at a financial guarantee as an innovative tool to support investments, both by the IFIs, but particularly by the private sector. So all this, of course, is important, but we need to be very, very conscious of the role that the public sector has to play in all of this to make sure that there is a strategic approach at the political level for these funds to be meaningfully used and to encourage the private sector to come in. So maybe one final point from my end is to say the EU will continue to support, of course, recovery efforts in the Caribbean and with grants, of course, as we always have. But the introduction of this new instrument, I think, opens quite a lot of scope for innovative discussions, which we've already had with colleagues, partners like the CDB, Monica, but also with other IFIs, this Inter-American Development Bank, for example, because we were looking at, indeed, resilient infrastructure options, how to come in, innovative schemes to support these. We've seen in other regions that the guarantee can play a strong role. And so we definitely like to develop this together with other partners, also to mobilize that kind of capital that is sitting in the banks, sitting in investment firms, sitting in insurance, pension schemes, etc. The type of investor that is looking for an de-risked investment. There are options. We need to look at them closely. Thanks a lot. I don't want to take more of your time.
Thank you very much, Mr. De La Mota. Thank you for your contribution. And I think you have actually actively answered one of the questions that we had. We said from the beginning that we would prioritize the contributions of the distinguished panelists that we had today. So I will only give space, because we don't have much more time, for one question. It's a question that was placed by the representative of ITU, of the International Telecommunications Union, to Ms. LeBennett. And it said, let me retrieve, can you please elaborate a bit more on the provision of ICT devices if a country or an agency is interested in getting tablets, for instance, to a number of students in rural communities? Would the CDB be able to assist? Maybe I can add, is the CDB assisting already? Over to you, Monica.
Thanks. What I was referring to is what we have done with our repurposing. And what we have done is that for countries that had existing education projects that had undisbursed balances, we were able to utilize those undisbursed balances for the provision of ICT equipment and so on. Now, going forward, if a country wants to do that on a wider scale for a rural community and so on, we can, in fact, do a project with that country for that. But of course, it would take, the process would take a little longer. And what we were trying to do with this effort is to do something immediate, because we recognized that we needed to have the the tablets in place as quickly as possible. So if there are countries that are interested in providing tablets and so on for their rural communities, we can in fact appraise a project for them. Of course, these were all loans. As I mentioned earlier, CDB does not have a lot of grants, but these are loans. And if a country is eligible for concessional resources, then we can utilize our concessional resources for that project, right? So that what the country would have to do is to get on to us, and we would take it from there. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much to all the panelists. My profuse apologies to those participants of ours who have placed questions that we couldn't answer live. We will come back. We will send them around to see if any of the panelists wish to provide an answer. Let me use the last minute of this first panel on the E-series to announce the panel of Thursday, same time at 11 o'clock. We will have the keynote speech of the Honorable Premier of the British Virgin Islands and the participation of the Finance Minister of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Caribbean Director of the World Bank, the High Commissioner of Canada, and our own UNICEF representative for the Caribbean countries. Until then, thank you very much once again for your participation. To all of the panelists, to all those who registered, please stay tuned. The E-series will continue on Thursday and next week. Thank you very much and have a nice afternoon.
Thank you.